This is a broadcasting from Stockholm Freeworld Forum with Swedish and international guests. We have launched what we call Freeworld Connect in order to highlight all the issues that the world is facing. And today we're going to discuss Russian misuse of history, aiming to discuss how the Victory Day, as it is called in Russia, is celebrated on Saturday. The Day of Peace is in Europe celebrated on the 8th of May, but in Russia, the 9th of May has become a platform for rewriting history and to make history a way of how to change the future. We have today launched two briefs or papers, one from Dr. Gudrun Persson, who is a Deputy Research Director at the Swedish National Defense Research Institute, and from Patrik Oksanen, who is a Senior Fellow at Freeworld. And we have with us Edvard Lucas, Senior Vice President, Center for European Policy Analysis, and Katarina Tracz, who is the Executive Director of Stockholm Freeworld Forum. And I myself, my name is Gunnar Hökmark, and I'm Chair of Stockholm Freeworld Forum. We are going to launch this discussion, but first I would like to ask Katarina just to launch the theme and the scope of this discussion. So please, Katarina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gunnar, and I would like to thank all experts for joining us in this afternoon's Freeworld Connect. The theme today is Russia and the misuse of history. The reason why we are launching this theme today is that we are a couple of days ahead of May 9th, which is celebrated as Victory Day in Russia. Ahead of this, we can notice heavy mobilization from Russia when it comes not only to celebration activities, but also when it comes to various activities that refer to history. And it has been noticed across the world in various countries how Russia often tends to misuse and falsify history for political purposes, that is, to use history as a power tool. So for this reason, we have asked two experts, Gudrun Persson, who is with us today, and also our own Patrik Oksanen, who's a Senior Fellow with Freeworld, who's also here today, to write a report each on this theme, and we will release these reports later this afternoon. I recommend them warmly. Also, we have Edvard Lucas with us, who is a Russia expert, journalist, and a fellow think tanker today. So I'm very excited about today's discussion, and I think that we will discuss Russia, but also a broader context, how authoritarian countries tend to misuse history as a political power tools, and how we could and should react to that.
Very good. And of course, how to look upon how Russia and others are misusing the history in order to support their own foreign policies is extremely important to see and understand. Gudrun Persson, would you like to start, present your reflections as they are presented in the paper, but also what you would like to highlight now here, please?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for having me in this forum. So, of course, we're dealing with a country, as everyone knows, that where the past is as unpredictable as its future. But joking aside, it's a very serious situation we're facing at the moment. First of all, I'd like to highlight that there's nothing new necessarily in this policy in the Russian context. It's also not exclusive to Russia to want to use its history to create a sort of national identity. However, Russia stands out in several ways. First of all, the authoritarian direction of Russian politics makes it very seriously. Secondly, there's an aggressiveness at the moment, which makes it impossible to discuss and even highlight key events in Russian history, because they are met with such aggressive tone. I mean, for instance, the Secretary of the Security Council yesterday had an article in Argumenty Fakty, a Russian journal, where he simply stated that everyone else is lying and we are telling the truth. This is not a serious discussion. So, and then what many people that I find in the West don't understand, that this is about politics, high-level politics, the efforts to what they call combat historical falsifications is written into the military doctrine. The armed forces have an explicit role to combat in the field of history. And this makes it serious. There are a number of power ministries involved in this, including Ministry of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Security Council, Ministry of Culture, etc. So, again, what we are seeing is that blank spots are being reappearing in Russian history. A few examples: the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the secret protocols can no longer be discussed in a serious manner. Katyn, that Gorbachev in his time apologized for, is again being blurred. Key events in the history. As we speak, Russia has launched criminal charges against the Czech Republic and against Finland. Poland has been attacked severely, not least last year, several times. And the list goes on. So what are the reasons for this? And to my mind, it's about two, maybe three things. First of all, to mobilize the Russian population, to rally around the flag, if you will. Secondly, it's about searching a national identity to support the political leadership and Putin personally. Putin himself has said that, you know, we must correct historical injustices. Now, to my mind, to open that in a European context, to start correcting historical injustices, it's like opening Pandora's box. It simply will never end, as we all know. So I think I'll stop there to begin with, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. And now we go forward to Patrik, who has presented another paper today. Please, the floor is yours, Patrik.
Thank you very much. And I will take and start somewhere where Gudrun ended, because what I've been looking at is basically two things: how history has been used against Russia's neighbor, and the second is how Russia has deployed the celebration of the Victory Day around the world, using the tool of the Immortal Regiments March. You know, perhaps you see the pictures of people carrying around photographs of relatives or other people who were combating during World War II and perhaps also died there. And these tools that Russia has used is trying to make the theme of the May 9th broader in other countries, and we have seen that Russia has deployed this ceremony around the globe in a lot of countries, and taking an increasing speed of that after the annexation of Crimea. So it's been really a development during the 5 last years, and the purpose here is of course trying to connect the Russian diaspora, everyone who is in the Russian world. But you can also see that they are outreaching in a broader sense, because they want to collect also people in the peace movement into this. So there are phrasing about these manifestations are open for everyone who is anti-fascist and want to have peace. So they are trying to evolve this day in the Western world to general day of peace celebration. And when doing that, they also get a tool to mobilize people around in the Western world for the purposes. And you can see how the embassies and different branches of the government are helping out in organizing these activities. And they are also taking part in countries like Sweden that didn't take part in World War II, for example. Also in Finland, who was the only democracy in the eastern part of Europe that never got occupied by Soviet Union after the war, and were fighting against Soviet Union. So that's one leg of the report. The other leg is looking at events that Gudrun mentioned, attacks on Czech Republic, Poland, the Baltic countries, and Finland in regard to history. And Gudrun mentioned that Russia has started prosecution cases against Czech Republic, and that is about the removal of the Marshal Konev statue in Prague. And they have changed legislation in Russia, making it criminal offense to remove World War II monuments and deploying that on a third sovereign country. There are also some very remarkable media reports from the Czech Republic noted in this report, and that is media reports with reference to the Czech security police stating that Russian diplomats have taken into the country poison, and also that the mayor responsible for this removal of the statue has received police protection. So that is a psychological, very tough measure taken against the mayor in Prague, even if the plan wasn't to use the poison, or it was the plan to use the poison. If these reports are correct, we don't know that at this time. And in the case of Finland, the Russians have started to claim that there were gas chambers in Karelia, and that the Finns should have used them in order to mass execute Russian prisoner of war. And that is, of course, well, it's nonsense. And we have seen in the Finnish case that this has been ongoing, with starting to try to change the image of a place in close area of Lake Onega, Sandarmoch, where Stalin's victims were executed during the 30s, and they are trying to frame that as now as a burial ground of victims of Finns during the continuation war. So you see how they are mixing history. And also notable, Poland has been blamed for the outbreak of World War II. Poland, the victim, is trying to be portrayed as the perpetrator. And of course, the Baltic countries in the Russian attacks are freely joined the Soviet Union in 1940. I mean, we know today we would describe these events in 1939, 1940 in the Baltic countries like a hybrid warfare where it ended with occupation. So that is basically the report in a short summary.
Gunnar, we can't hear you right now. We'll see if he unmutes.
I forgot. Thank you very much. Thanks. Edward, what is the aim or the impact or the consequences of a rewriting of the history as we see now in Russia? I mean, for example, when you're trying to give legitimacy to the invasion of Poland or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, what does it mean for the future? Is it only a matter of cleaning up history, or how can we interpret it?
Well, it's certainly not about disinterested historical, or historiography. This is a long way from any sort of it's always worthwhile. Really know what we think we know, and could see no taboos. Legitimacy and illegitimacy, saying that the rest of Eastern Europe after 1945 and its occupation was just a liberation. It's about the establishing all those countries that came in part of the Soviet Empire in the late 1940s as being geopolitical trophies that Russia, the Soviet Union earned, and Russia has inherited some kind of right over these countries. So this is the fundamental point about the sphere of privileged interests, or whatever other phrase the Russians use, the near abroad. It all boils down to the fact that we liberated, as they put it, these countries in 1945, and therefore we have some rights there. There's also dealing with illegitimacy, the terrible historical problem for Russia and for the Soviet Union is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And so this casts an indelible stain on any claims of the Soviet leadership then, or Russia now, to be a sort of heroic anti-fascist power. And so that was a very difficult obstacle, which was dealt in one way by Mikhail Gorbachev, and then by Yeltsin, who said, yes, this happened, it was terrible, we're really sorry. But under Putin, this has gone in the opposite direction. First of all, to relativize it and say, well, hang on, lots of countries did it. Ours was by far not the worst. And now moving on to sort of even more casting a whole cloud of obscurity over it. We see the same with Katyn, the massacre of the Polish officers. This was first of all acknowledged by Yeltsin and Gorbachev, and was the idea that modern Russia would ever deny that this happened was absolutely shocking. I remember the first time this happened in 2006. It was front page news. Amazing. This was like Holocaust denial in Germany. Really shocking. Now it's just it's been relativized. Putin saying that lots of other massacres happened, and then going back to these sort of conspiracy theories that actually it was something different. Then the illegitimacy is also about making out that these countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are illegitimate. They are the inheritors of the alliance with Nazi Germany. They are basically combatants on the Nazi side, and they're Nazis then and Nazis now. And so that's about undermining those countries' reputations in the rest of the world. And it spreads very broadly. As you mentioned before, Poland is now attacked as being somehow responsible for the outbreak of war. Finland's attacked as being an accessory to the Holocaust. And the problem is that public understanding of history is extremely limited. For most people, the only thing they really remember about the 20th century was that there was Hitler and he was bad. And so if you say we fought Hitler, that means we're good, and these people fought us, well, that means they must be Nazis and they're bad. So there's a kind of very crude syllogism, and it works. But I would finish by saying that I think that Russia's overdone it. I think that we see really serious pushback now. We started with this European, the Council of Europe equating Nazism and communism, which is quite right. And I think more and more people are wising up to what Russia's up to. And although they can intensify support in some quarters, some parts of Russia, and in some places elsewhere, I think it's a diminishing asset rather than an increasing one, because there is such pushback against it.
Yes.
Gunnar, you have to unmute.
Rewriting history can have the aim to give the autocracy a stronger standing, giving legitimacy to Stalin, for example. But what would you all say about the impact on foreign policy, on how you look upon the neighbors, how you look upon the Baltic states, the borders with Finland, Poland, etc.? It would be good to hear from you all, how you look upon the consequences regarding security, but also how Russia and Putin would like to make this rewriting of the history more operational, if you see what I mean. Gudrun, could you start?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's a policy that creates tension both at home and abroad. We mostly talked about the tension abroad, but equally inside Russia. I mean, Yuri Dmitriev of Memorial is facing criminal charges, and he obviously he has explored the Stalinist mass graves in Sandarmoch, and he's now facing criminal charges. And there are several other examples, not as known as Dmitriev. And regarding the impact for our neighborhood and in Eastern Europe, I mean, there are serious consequences. Putin, back in 2013, relativized the start of the Second World War, the Winter War, the attack against Finland, and he said that, look, there's nothing strange with that. You have to all to understand that the border was too close to Leningrad, so of course we had to attack Finland. And that kind of thinking, we need to be very aware of it. Now, does this mean that Russian tanks will start rolling over borders? I don't think so. I agree with, not in the immediate future in any case, and I agree with Edward that I mean, what we're talking about here is that these are the efforts of the political leadership in Putin to rewrite history. That is not to say that he's going to succeed doing that. And as I said, in Russia, it's also in some quarters and serious historians, it's very controversial, and it creates tensions. I'd also like to add just one more thing, that the central agency, Russian agency, archival agency that deals with a lot of the archives, in recent years was moved and is now directly subordinate to the presidential administration. And it's a clear sign that they want to be able to censor the archives in a direct way. So the intentions are there. That is not to say that they're going to succeed, but the implications, and should they start to move, we need to be aware of it.
But Gudrun, if one is rewriting history because you say you need to correct the history, isn't it a rather short step then to say that you need to correct the present reality?
Yes, but first of all, and as I said initially, part of these efforts is to mobilize the Russian population to rally around the flag. And besides, we saw it in Crimea. We saw it in Georgia. So it's definitely something that could happen.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not discarding that. I'm just saying that as long as we are aware of this, and we know that the military instrument is never far away when it comes to Russia. So,
Patrik, what would you say is the impact of the consequences of this rewriting of history?
Well, first, I agree with Gudrun that you need to understand the internal dimension of it to secure the power of Kremlin. But when you look at it externally, I think you should view it as one tool in the influence toolbox. It's one of many tools used in order to advance Russia's interest abroad. And what is in Russia's interest? Well, in Russia's interest is to break up the solidarity of the EU. And here history can be a tool to start to aggregate feelings within Europe in order to use this tool smartly. By attacking Poland, for example, in a time when if I put it diplomatically, when the rest of Europe's perhaps enthusiasm to defend Poland is not that great because of the development internal in Poland and the discussion about the legal system, for example. And if we do not stand up in solidarity with the Poles in this time, the feeling of being someone who is not valued or getting solidarity from the rest of Europe will grow in Poland, and here tensions will start to grow within the EU. So by attacking a country like Poland, you can fuel dissentment within the EU. And the second reflection here is I mean, to use history in the Baltic countries is trying to connect the Russian diaspora to the Kremlin project, and they are vital as a tool of influence in the Baltic countries. And if you want to repeat history, then you need to rewrite it so you don't know that this has happened before. And Russia was successful in Crimea because we were not ready and we didn't understand it. And if we are not pushing back, like Mr. Lucas stated, like we are doing right now, then we might end up in the same scenario that we are taken by surprise, and we're kind of buying the Russian narrative that Crimea is Russian, has always been that historically, etc., etc., etc. In other areas. So that is why it's so important to push back.
Yes, and I don't want to sound too alarmistic, but I'm just trying to get into the logic of this, because you mentioned Crimea, for example, and the invasion and the annexation of Crimea is very much linked to the rewriting of the history, or the historical definition that Crimea since all times has belonged to Russia and is a huge and central part of Russia. But if you say that, for example, some Baltic countries in reality belongs to Russia, or that you say that some borders to Finland in reality should be different, or if you say that Poland in reality was responsible for World War II and a lot of other things, and even if you don't do anything about it for the time being, aren't you creating, so to say, a deficit of action? Would Edward and Katarina say some words? Or Patrik, you can start, and then Katarina and Edward.
Well, I just wanted to confirm your reflection, because what you're doing there is undermining the idea of collective security. I mean, you don't want to stand up and put your nose in a bloody mess that you don't think is fair and just. And you might not want to risk a nuclear war for something that you believe. If you start to believe that that is a legitimate Russian, then the fundaments of NATO and the EU will start to crumble. So that's my reflection on it.
Katarina, and then Edward. Edward.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And we saw this very clearly in Estonia with the Bronze Soldier in 2007. This was a Soviet war memorial which had become a flashpoint for civil disorder, and the Estonian authorities moved it from the center of Tallinn to a military cemetery on the outside of the city. And this caused an absolutely apoplectic reaction from the Russians, with riots involving local Russians coordinated by Russian special services, very strong diplomatic protests, attacks on the Estonian embassy in Moscow, economic pressure, whole massive cyber attack. And this was a very clear example of how the history can be a kind of lightning rod for other political conflicts. I think that the stirring up patriotic sentiment at home, it's worth is that indeed a big thing, as Gudrun mentioned. It's worth pointing out this is quite recent. If you look back at Soviet history in the 1950s and 60s, they didn't make a big deal about the Second World War. It was so traumatic, had it been, that there was a feeling really of not making
Thanks.
Show may
The sound is not working very well just now, at least not for me.
May the 9th, and disabled people were cleared out of the disabled war veterans were seen as an embarrassment rather than as something heroic. And this it was in the as the Soviet Union became weaker, they relied more and more on this. So I think fundamentally it is a sign of weakness rather than of strength. In Russia, it's noted, I think that the Putin's having to cancel, obviously very inconvenient for him, but I think that the Russian public is more interested now in other things rather than this sort of heavily officialized version. It's not just about saying the Soviet Union was great and so is Russia and everyone else is Nazis. There are sort of sub-narratives. So, for example, stirring up hostility between Poland and Ukraine, very difficult history effort to try and stir up animosity there, stirring it up between successfully. So there's plenty of, in every case, you can expand the historical space, the more you can then instrumentalize it.
Thank you very much. Katarina?
Yes, with the risk of repeating parts of what Edward said, because the sound was breaking up, so I didn't hear everything. But yes, I do think that we should take this seriously, just as Patrik pointed out. There's definitely a risk this is definitely a domestical issue also in Russia, first and foremost, but it has implications in other countries, and we have seen this already, as several panelists have mentioned. I would like to sort of throw in a thought and a question for the rest of the panel before we round up also, but have we seen other countries sort of copying Russia's behavior here? I know that we have Russia specialists amongst us, so maybe it's not the most fair question to ask to them, but have you observed, for instance, from China, as you see China rather copying Russian behavior when it comes to information activities? Have we seen other countries, authoritarian ones, starting to use these tools as a means to project power?
What does Gudrun? Could you start with that?
Well, as you said, I'm mostly focused on Russia, and since developments in this area have been very hectic lately, so I'm prepared to leave that to Patrik.
Well, I would say, as far as China is concerned, if I
Edward?
style of leadership is to really ramp up resentment about what happened to China in the 19th century, this idea of a century of humiliation. And it's a way of linking. Yes, so I was jumping in there. I would say that Xi Jinping has very much done this in China. I wouldn't say what they call the century of humiliation, which happened with China's and then defeats at the hands of the colonial powers, notably Britain and other Europeans. And this is linked in the sort of Chinese official story to what's happening to China now. They did dreadful things to us in the 19th century, and now they're trying to constrain us and undermine the one China policy and support separatism and so on. So it stitches together and it's combined in China with an absolute refusal to talk about history within China. So the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and the Tiananmen Square massacres are all what we call in the Russian context white spaces. They just can't be talked at. Now, in one sense, this is very successful, and it means that you have a nice simple narrative and it fuels patriotic sentiment at home, and people in China feel they're the heirs of the boxers and the Boxer Rebellion. But it's also very fragile, because you only need to start poking at it a bit and say to Chinese people what actually happened in 1989, and when they find out they've been lied to about that and about the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, then the whole edifice starts tottering down, because you think if the official history is wrong in one respect, then it must be quite likely wrong in other respects as well. And that's the great vulnerability of this sort of official historiography, that as it's not based on truth, you can attack it with truth, and the lies run through it like a thread. Pull that thread, and the whole thing comes tumbling down.
Thank you very much, Patrik.
Well, beside China, if we move on to Europe, one could just reflect that in the Balkan area, history is never far away and being used by different leaders, and also we see this in Hungary, where the Treaty of Trianon after World War I is now coming back into the Hungarian politics in a way that we didn't see before, and of course that is the tool of Orban to create the national identity around his project of Hungary. So that was a short reflection.
Yes, maybe we should have a last round, and I would like you all to give some short reflections on first of all, what shall we do with this rewriting of history? How shall we face it? And the second thing is, what sort of actions shall we be prepared to that can follow this rewriting of history? I mean, a common phrase is that if you had said A, you need to say B. And most of you have clarified that your view is that this rewriting of history is mainly for domestic purposes. But on the other hand, if you create feelings and tensions that are based on some sort of deficit versus other countries, that you really should be more control, that you really should correct borders. I mean, the Crimea experience is a very dull one. It is dull and somber in this respect. So it would be good to get your comments on all those things, and maybe just in 1.5 or 2 minutes. That is not possible, of course, but you can make it possible. Patrik, you can start because I have you in my view already.
Yes, and I point out different suggestions in my report, but if I can just take 1 or 2 of them here, I would point out the importance of not doing this in silence. When Poland, for example, is attacked, or Finland or Czech Republic or the Baltic countries are attacked from official Russian politicians or bureaus and so on in this matter, we need to have attention to it. We need to address it. We need to put it where it belongs, and also make statements of solidarity. Divided we fall, united we stand, so to speak. Another thing that I think is important is popular culture, and I'm really looking forward for a huge Netflix production that will cover events, the dramatic events in eastern part of Europe in 1938 up to 1956. I think that would be a wonderful way of educating the broader population in history.
That could be a thing for not only Netflix, but for all public service companies, because it is very much about our history in the present. Edward, would you like to have 2 minutes on these questions, how to face it and what to await?
Yes. Well, I think, first of all, solidarity is very important, and we should always stick up for countries like Poland or Estonia or Finland or whoever's in the Lithuania, whoever's in the firing line. I think it's partly for public diplomacy, and I think that embassies need to have a history attaché. You need to have someone at a Polish or wherever embassies radio and talk about it, and on television and so on, because you have economics attachés, you have trade attachés, you have military attachés. You need someone who really knows the history, because this is now a battleground. That's one thing. I think that we need to be very honest about, as the Russians always make, is you did bad things too. To which our answer should be, yes, we did bad things too. And you know what? We're really sorry about them. So if I'm Polish, I'm sorry about Chechnya and taking part in the attack on Czechoslovakia. If I'm British, I'm sorry we sent the Cossacks back at the war in Stalin's Soviet camps. I'm sorry about the Munich Agreement. You know, we see there's plenty of pride to go around, but there's also plenty of shame to go around. And once you take that approach yourself, you're then in a much better position to attack the imbalance of the Russian/Soviet approach, which is all about pride and glory and has no room for shame or contrition.
Thank you very much. Katarina?
No, I would like to begin with highly recommending to read the recommendations in Patrik Oksanen's report that sort of cover all level what both states can do and what can be done on the citizen and civil society level, because I think that all of these levels need to be engaged, and also stress especially the last point that Edward mentioned, that sort of if we want to be able to criticize it, we have to be frank about our own history. Now, in a country like Sweden, the general knowledge about history is very low. So Swedes tend to be not so susceptible in either caring about these types of attacks or discovering them. But in a country like Poland, for instance, history plays a very important role. And unfortunately, we have seen Poland also trying to make attempts to sort of frame the picture of their history in a way that suits their interests and their self-image in order to sort of promote national sentiments. And that doesn't help when they themselves are being attacked by Russia. So being frank and acting on all levels is what I would like to highlight.
Gudrun, please.
Yes, right. Since I'm a researcher and a scholar, I always stress knowledge and awareness and curiosity, and to learn and study Russian history, to be well read and to be able to engage in serious discussions. The problem right now is that the Russian political leadership is not at all, as I said, interested in serious discussions, but rather in a rather aggressive tone tries to shape the hearts and minds of future generations. And in a sense, it's one of the few tools left to the Russian political leadership at the moment. And but the focus on the younger generation is what makes it so serious to my mind. So be well read and fear nothing. Would be my advice.
Thank you very much. I think one of the takeaways is from this discussion is, of course, the importance of history as an independent discipline, and the importance of history. I mean, that has sometimes been said because it's important for education and important for understanding of where we are. But when history is used for the means of foreign policy or security policy, it is becoming even more important to know industry, to understand history. Then I must say, I think whatever consequences you can see in the future of this is it is in some way risking to feed consequences that we need to be prepared for. The rewriting of the history is not independent from other parts of foreign policy or from the power of Putin. It's a part of the way of dealing with the power and to defending the power, but of course also to give legitimacy to claims on others. And we need to take that in consideration when we discuss security policy and defense policy. But maybe the more important takeaway from this discussion is the need for independent history and all over Europe. So we need to unite behind historians, independent historians, and give room for that. And it would be good if Netflix and public service would do some things about that. I would like to look upon those programs very much. Thank you very much for participating in Freeworld Connect. We try to connect the free world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.